I'd like to start this lecture with the story of Dan Buettner and his quest to find what he called blue zones. Buettner is an explorer and writer who got obsessed with tracking down communities of people who tend to live longer and healthier lives than normal. And in collaboration with National Geographic and a number of scientists interested in longevity, he visited a bunch of these communities and documented the lifestyles of the people living there. The team went to the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, where men live longer than anywhere else in the world. They went to a Seventh-day Adventist community in California, whose average lifespan is 10 years longer than the average American. They also visited a community in Okinawa, Japan, with the world's longest-lived women, a Greek island that experiences half as much heart disease as Americans, and a community of people in Costa Rica who are more than twice as likely as Americans to live to the age of 90. The group referred to these communities as blue zones, mainly because the original studies had used the color blue on a map to indicate regions with unusually large numbers of 100-year-olds. The team lived in these communities for a while and watched how the people lived. They observed what they ate, how they spent their time. They attended their social gatherings and religious services, and they interviewed them about their personal history and their lifestyle. And based on these experiences, they identified some consistent patterns that all these long-lived communities share and that distinguish them from other communities around the world. For one thing, their diet is different. They tend to eat less than Americans, and they eat a lot more plants. They also typically feel more valued as they get older and have a clear sense of purpose in their life, whether it's passing on their knowledge to the next generation or taking care of their grandchildren, or sometimes their great-great-great-grandchildren. Their lives are also relatively stress-free, and they often take time to relax and decompress. Well, we'll actually talk about a lot of these common features next time, but in this lecture, I want to focus on two other characteristics that the explorers identified in these blue zone communities, namely physical activity and social activity. All of these long-lived people spend a lot of time moving. They typically walk where they need to go rather than driving a car. Most of them maintain a garden and regularly engage in manual labor. They cook their meals from scratch and do all their household chores themselves. Now, notice, it's not that these people intentionally exercise or go to a gym. Rather, their normal routine just involves a lot of physical activity. And likewise, their routine involves a lot of social activity. All these communities are very tight-knit groups that interact with each other every day. Extended families often live together or nearby. The same friends often get together around the same time nearly every day, or they might just stop by unannounced for a visit. There's a deep network of social support and a genuine sense of belonging that many people in our more individualistic society probably don't experience. And again, it's not that these people intentionally plan to socialize. It's just deeply rooted in their culture. Now, here's the critical question. Are the shared features of these long-lived communities the reason that they live such long and healthy lives? Do their lifestyle choices actually cause them to live longer? Or is there some other cause? Well, in this lecture, we'll discuss scientific studies that have investigated these questions. We'll start by discussing the effects of physical activity on the mind and brain, and especially whether exercise can forestall some of the effects of aging. Then we'll turn to the effects of social activity and discuss whether interacting with other people can improve your health and lengthen your lifespan. And finally, we'll talk about mental activity. Is there any science to support the idea that training your brain can keep you sharp as you age? What about intense intellectual engagement, like learning a second language or taking a great course? Let's begin by talking about physical activity and exercise. Now, first of all, let me get one very obvious point out of the way. Physical activity is good for you, so it's no surprise that people who are physically active tend to live longer. For one thing, physical activity promotes a healthy cardiovascular system and therefore protects against heart disease. So naturally, physical activity does tend to lead to a longer life. But the question I want to address is less obvious. Does physical exercise make your brain healthier? And does it sharpen your cognitive abilities and perhaps even protect you from some of the cognitive declines that are associated with normal aging? A lot of evidence suggests that the answer to those questions is yes. First, a number of large longitudinal studies have found a correlation between physical activity and a healthy mind. Recall that a longitudinal study follows the same people over a period of time. One famous study at Harvard's School of Public Health was called the Nurses' Health Study. The researchers mailed questionnaires asking about walking and other physical activity to nearly 20,000 older nurses, starting back in 1986. Then they called up those same nurses 10 to 15 years later and asked them to perform some cognitive tests over the phone. And they found that the nurses who had been more physically active did better on the cognitive tests. The more active nurses also exhibited less of a drop-off in their cognitive performance as they got older. And it wasn't just vigorous exercise that helped. Nurses who walked at least 15 minutes a day showed the same benefits. Another large longitudinal study, called the Canadian Study of Health and Aging, followed over 4,000 people who had been cognitively normal 5 years earlier, in order to see who had developed cognitive impairments and dementia. And the most physically active people were about 40% less likely to have developed cognitive impairments compared with people who were not active. Likewise, the most physically active people were about 50% less likely to have developed dementia of the Alzheimer's type. And it wasn't just high physical activity that helped. Even low levels of activity reduced the risk of cognitive impairments and of Alzheimer's disease by about 33% compared to no activity. So, consistent with the Blue Zone findings, these studies demonstrate an association between physical activity and healthy aging. But keep in mind, these results are correlational. So we can't tell definitively whether physical activity actually causes improvements in cognition and health. So, what about studies in which scientists experimentally manipulate who exercises and who doesn't? Well, one influential study was conducted by Kirk Erickson and Arthur Kramer at the University of Illinois, along with a number of their colleagues. They randomly assigned 60 older people to 1 year of aerobic exercise and another 60 older people to 1 year of stretching and toning as a control condition. Now, the people in the exercise condition started out walking for 10 minutes, and they gradually increased to 40 minutes per session. The people in the stretching condition stretched and lifted weights, but they didn't do the kind of aerobic exercise that would increase their heart rate for an extended period of time. Now, both groups had their brains scanned before and after the training, and they also had their memory tested. And the scientists reported two particularly interesting results. First of all, the control group exhibited the normal age-related shrinkage in the hippocampus that we talked about in Lecture 4, and that we would normally expect in an older population. But the exercise group didn't. In fact, the volume of the hippocampus in the exercise group actually increased over the course of the year. Second, the people in the exercise group whose hippocampus grew the most also exhibited the largest improvements in memory. The bottom line is that aerobic exercise reversed the normal age-related shrinkage in the hippocampus and led to improved memory performance. A large number of animal studies have also demonstrated significant benefits from physical activity, both at a cognitive level and at a neural level. Now, although these studies don't involve humans, they can often be more informative than human studies because they can be more carefully controlled. For example, human studies are often confounded by how much exercise the control group engages in or how much social activity is involved. In animal studies, these kinds of factors can be completely controlled, making the experiments significantly cleaner and easier to interpret. Furthermore, animal studies make it possible to explore the biological mechanisms involved in much more detail than is possible in humans. And understanding those mechanisms could ultimately tell us why exercise improves cognition and forestalls aging. One of the most important animal studies was done by Mark Rosenzweig at Berkeley, William Greenough at the University of Illinois, and their colleagues. They found that rats that are raised in enriched environments with new toys every day and lots of other rats actually learn faster than rats raised in standard cages. Furthermore, these rats also have more connections between brain cells and an overall increase in cerebral cortex. But why? Well, one hypothesis is that rats in enriched environments are more physically active than rats in normal cages. Which raises the question, can physical activity alone produce these kinds of brain changes? Fred Gage and his colleagues at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies near San Diego began investigating that question in the mid-1990s, and they found that the answer is yes. In fact, they found that making rats exercise actually leads to growth of new brain cells in the hippocampus, the brain area we've repeatedly discussed as being crucial for memory. Now, before then, most neuroscientists assumed that we can't grow new brain cells in adulthood. But Gage's work proved that that assumption was wrong. Subsequent animal studies have shown that physical activity also leads to new blood vessels in the brain, to higher levels of chemicals that trigger growth in the brain, to increase resistance to brain damage, and to improved learning and cognitive performance. The effect of physical exercise on the mind and brain is now a very hot topic in neuroscience, and new discoveries are being made all the time. The take-home message for us is pretty simple, though. There's now quite a bit of evidence from correlational studies and from experimental studies in humans and animals that physical activity can stimulate the brain in important ways and sharpen our cognitive abilities. And you don't have to run a marathon. Just walking whenever you can might be enough. In fact, I think it's fair to say that engaging in regular physical activity is the single best thing you can do to maintain your brain's health as you age. But it's not the only thing. The people in the blue zones didn't just move a lot. They also socialized a lot. They live in tight-knit communities and they spend a lot of time interacting with their friends and family. So could these frequent social interactions help them to live longer, healthier lives? Let's turn to that question next. Laura Fertiglione and her colleagues tried to address this question in a large longitudinal study at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. They followed more than 1,200 older adults, assessing their social networks and testing their cognitive abilities over a 3-year period. They found that people with strong positive social networks were 60% less likely to develop dementia compared with people with a poor or limited social network. Furthermore, social support may also improve recovery after brain injury. For example, Maria Glymore at Columbia University and her colleagues investigated the effect of social support on recovery after a stroke. And stroke victims who had more social ties and stronger emotional support tended to perform better on cognitive tests 6 months after their stroke. Living alone versus with other people has also been shown to have a significant effect on cognition in older people. For example, one study followed over 1,000 European men over the age of 70 for 10 years. Men who had lost a partner, who were unmarried, or who lived alone, exhibited more than twice as much cognitive decline over the 10-year period compared with men who lived with someone. It's also important that the social interactions be positive rather than negative. In fact, people who report less satisfaction with their social network tend to exhibit greater cognitive decline than people who are more satisfied. So lots of evidence suggests that positive social interactions can improve cognition and can slow down age-related cognitive decline, and maybe even reduce your risk of developing dementia. But there's a problem with all these studies, and it's the same problem that we found with many of the exercise studies we discussed. They're correlational. And what's the problem with correlational studies again? You got it. Correlation does not imply causation. To infer causality, we need experimental studies that randomly assign some people to more social interaction and some people to less. And so far, there just aren't very many such studies. One study that comes close was conducted by Elizabeth Stein Morrow at the University of Illinois and her colleagues. They randomly divided up a large number of older people into an experimental group and a control group. The people in the experimental group worked together with 5 to 7 other participants on a long-term project that involved 20 team meetings over a period of about 6 months. The control group just continued life as normal. The researchers tested a number of cognitive abilities, both before and after the intervention. And the experimental group showed greater improvement on all of them compared with the control group. Of course, it's impossible to know whether it was the social interaction per se that led to the observed improvements in cognitive function. In addition to greater social interaction, the experimental group also engaged in more mental activity. It's even likely that they engaged in more physical activity than the control group, because they had to physically get to and from the 20 group meetings. So, although engaging in this group activity helped, we don't yet know why. And to be honest, that's where things stand with respect to the influence of social interaction on cognition in older people. All the evidence suggests that it probably helps, but scientists haven't nailed it down for sure yet. And hopefully that will change in the not too distant future. Okay, so we've reviewed evidence that physical activity can promote brain health and cognitive function. And we've also discussed evidence that social activity can do the same. What about mental activity? Can exercising your mind keep it healthy and perhaps delay or even reverse the cognitive declines associated with aging? Well, first, let's talk about the current craze surrounding brain training. As you probably know, a number of websites, computer programs, and apps are now being marketed that claim that they can keep your brain sharp and improve your memory and attention. So, do these products actually work? Well, if you look at the advertising for these so-called brain games, you might think that the answer is a resounding yes. The ads often mention that the games were designed by leading neuroscientists, suggesting that their effectiveness has been demonstrated by solid scientific evidence. Some of the company websites even maintain a list of papers from the scientific literature, lending further credence to the idea that these brain games have already been proven to work. So, what do scientists working in the field actually believe about the effectiveness of these kinds of brain games? Well, in 2014, the Stanford Center on Longevity and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin gathered together a bunch of leading scientists in the field to discuss that question and to prepare a statement summarizing their consensus about what the existing science has to say. And they reached a number of important conclusions. First, claims promoting the advantages of brain games are often exaggerated and sometimes misleading. In particular, although cognitive training can definitely improve your performance on the specific task that you're practicing, there isn't convincing evidence that it will improve your performance on cognitive tasks that you engage in every day. For example, if you practice solving crossword puzzles or Sudoku puzzles every day, then you'll likely get better at solving crossword puzzles and Sudoku puzzles. You might be able to solve harder and harder problems, and you might get faster at finding the solutions. But the critical question is whether that kind of cognitive training will generalize and sharpen your thinking in other domains. For example, will your everyday memory and problem solving improve as a result of your cognitive training? Will you be less likely to lose your keys or get better at remembering to take your medicine? Will you get better at organizing a big event or solving a complicated problem at work? Put simply, will the cognitive training really make any difference in the rest of your life? And so far, the evidence isn't very strong. Cognitive training has been shown to produce improvements in specific practiced skills, and that improvement sometimes extends to other closely related tasks. But in general, the gains are typically very narrow. Getting better at crosswords or Sudoku doesn't lead to lasting improvements in your everyday memory or problem-solving skills, despite what the brain game advertisements seem to suggest. The scientists' consensus statement also pointed out the importance of considering opportunity costs when evaluating the benefits of cognitive training. In particular, if you're spending time playing brain games or solving crossword puzzles, then you're typically not spending that time being physically active or socializing. If you're doing cognitive training on a computer, then that means that you're not gardening or walking to the store or visiting with friends and family. But as we've seen, there's quite a bit of evidence that physical activity and social interactions do help brain health. And so pursuing such activities may actually be a better use of your time. The scientists concluded their statement with the following 5 recommendations. First, as best you can, try to lead a physically active, intellectually challenging, and socially engaged life. Before investing significant time and money in brain games, consider that the time playing that game might be better spent hiking, cooking, or playing with your children or grandchildren. Second, try to incorporate physical exercise into your routine because it's been shown to be an effective way to improve your health, including your brain health. Third, be skeptical about claims based on the results of a single study or on the recommendation of a single scientist. Many claims are based on fairly narrow findings that didn't generalize to real life and that haven't been replicated. Fourth, remember that no studies have demonstrated that playing brain games will cure or prevent the development of Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia. And fifth, don't expect the benefits of mental training to last for extended periods of time after you've stopped the training. Mental training isn't a vaccine that can prevent age-related cognitive decline. Okay, so there isn't strong evidence that brain training games lead to general improvements in cognitive function. But does that mean we don't need to stay cognitively engaged and keep our minds active? Definitely not. For one thing, there's solid evidence that cognitive training that specifically targets processing speed, episodic memory, and executive control can slow down age-related declines in those domains. For example, consider the ACTIVE study, which stands for Advanced Cognitive Training for Independent and Vital Elderly. This study recruited over 2,500 healthy older people and gave them an intense 5 to 6 week training course on specific aspects of cognition that tend to decline with age. One group was taught strategies to use their episodic memory more effectively and repeatedly practiced using those strategies. Another group was trained on reasoning skills and practiced solving problems. And a third group received processing speed training, in which they practiced searching for increasingly complicated visual patterns as fast as possible. And as hoped, each group significantly improved in the domain in which they were trained. That is, the memory group did better than a control group on tests of memory. The reasoning group did better on tests of reasoning. and the processing group did better on tests of processing speed. Furthermore, 5 years later, the training groups were still performing better than the control group in the domains in which they were trained. More recently, Adam Ghazali and his colleagues at the University of California at San Francisco reported a similar result when training executive function. They developed a video game called Neuro Racer that required identifying road signs either while simultaneously driving a computer car or in isolation. Now, as you might expect, people get distracted when they have to simultaneously drive a car, and so performance on the road sign task suffers. And that drop in performance is called a multitasking cost. Performing multiple tasks leads to a cost in performance. And consistent with the finding that executive functions decline with age, this multitasking cost got bigger and bigger with age. 20-year-olds exhibited a small deficit in performance when they had to drive while identifying signs. 30-year-olds had a bigger deficit. And with each passing decade, the drop in performance got larger and larger. But the researchers then trained a bunch of older adults on multitasking. They recruited 46 people between the ages of 60 and 85 and had them play the game. Now, initially, performance on the sign task dropped by about 70% when they had to drive compared with when they didn't. That is, they all exhibited a big multitasking cost. But then they divided these people up into 3 groups. Some people trained for 3 hours a week for 4 weeks on the multitasking version that required identifying road signs while simultaneously driving. Others trained for the same amount of time, but practiced the sign task and the driving task separately, never together. Finally, a third set of people didn't practice at all, and they served as a no-contact control group. Afterwards, everyone came back and played the game again. Now, predictably, the people in both the multitasking training group and the single-task training group had gotten better at identifying signs. But the key question is how much would their performance drop when they had to multitask? And the older people who had been trained on multitasking now showed very little cost. In fact, their multitasking cost was actually smaller than the cost exhibited by the 20-year-olds in the original study. Furthermore, these people were still showing very little multitasking cost 6 months later, despite having not practiced the game in the meantime. And perhaps most exciting of all, these benefits transferred to other tests of executive function, including a working memory task, on which the participants were not trained. So the bottom line is that intense cognitive training that targets episodic memory, processing speed, and executive function can improve our abilities in those domains. And given that these are the very domains that tend to decline with age, that's very good news. Finally, what about more traditional intellectual engagement, like learning a second language, or taking a great course for that matter? Well, I'm happy to report that that kind of activity has also proven to be helpful. First of all, a large number of studies have investigated the relationship between formal education and cognitive vitality in late life. And the consistent finding is that higher levels of education are associated with less cognitive decline during old age. Likewise, learning a second language has also been associated with improved cognitive function in older adults, particularly improved executive function. Neuroimaging studies have even found greater white matter integrity and prefrontal cortex volume in bilinguals compared with monolinguals. And remember, white matter integrity and prefrontal cortex volume both tend to decline with age. Of course, these kinds of associations are just correlations, and they don't allow us to infer causality. And so, as you might expect, scientists have vigorously debated how to interpret the observed associations. What was needed was an experimental study that randomly assigned some older people to a control condition and other older people to a condition in which they were seriously intellectually engaged. And in 2014, Denise Park, Jennifer Lodi-Smith, and their colleagues at the University of Texas at Dallas did just that. Specifically, they recruited about 220 older adults, and they randomly assigned groups to different conditions. 3 of the groups were assigned to what they called a productive engagement condition, in which they took an intense 14-week course that required active learning. One group took a course on photography, in which they spent about 15 hours a week learning how to use digital cameras and how to edit their photographs using professional software like Photoshop. A second group took a course on quilting that progressed from basic skills up to complex individual projects that involved using computer-driven sewing machines. And a third group spent half their time learning digital photography and the other half learning quilting. The control groups were assigned to what they called a receptive engagement condition, in which they spent the same amount of time pursuing an activity, but the activity did not require the intense intellectual engagement that taking a course involves. For example, some people in the receptive engagement condition listened to music, and others solved puzzles. And the researchers found that people in the productive engagement conditions improved significantly more on measures of cognitive function than did the people in the receptive engagement conditions. In particular, episodic memory improved quite substantially. So the take-home message is that mental activity can indeed help us age more gracefully, but it needs to be the right kind of mental activity. In particular, cognitive training that focuses on episodic memory, processing speed, and executive function can help to offset the typical age-related declines that are observed in those domains. And intense intellectual engagement, like you get from taking a traditional course, has also proven to be beneficial. Okay, let's wrap up. In this lecture, we talked about the effects of physical, social, and mental activity on the aging brain. We saw that there's now substantial evidence demonstrating that physical activity can help keep you mentally sharp. And there's growing evidence that positive social interactions and serious intellectual engagement can do so as well. So, is there anything else we can do to keep our brains in good shape as we age? Well, there definitely is. In our next lecture, I want to focus on 2 things, namely eating right and avoiding stress. As we'll see, diet and stress have both been shown to have a significant effect, not only on our health in general, but specifically on the health of our brains. See you next time.